In late 1965, Dell Comics introduced Lobo, a Western series about, starring an African American cowboy. And as you can see, the very first page of the very first issue, he starts off as being a soldier in the Union Army. So this is set right at the end of the Civil War, and in a fairly, common convention in Western comics and Westerns in general, he is falsely accused of a crime he did not commit and becomes a fugitive. So he's essentially on the run, but he's innocent, and he just happens to be black. Now, if you read through that first issue, there's nothing in the plot that requires him to be black. Um, there are no statements being made about race. He just is a cowboy, and he just happens to be black, which actually is consistent with history, much more consistent than it has been with popular culture, because in the Old West, it's been estimated that anywhere from 20 to 25% of working cowboys were black, which you don't really see that in Gunsmoke and Bonanza in the 1950s. So, um, something that is very important to note about this is that Lobo, in December 1965, was the very first black character to have their own title. Created by two white guys, D.J. Arneson, the writer, and Tony Tallarico, the artist. And in recent years, they've disagreed with one another about whose idea it first was. But the two of them did it, and Helen Meyer, president of Dell, signed off on it. And this was a historic thing that no one really noticed too much at the time. And in large part, that's because the comic only lasted for 2 issues before it was canceled. Now, books get canceled because they don't sell enough copies. In this case, there was an extra reason why that happened. It's kind of similar, except more extreme, than what happened with all Negro comics back in the 40s. Remember, they were uh, essentially driven out of business back then because no one would sell them the paper they needed. In this case, the problem was wholesalers would not distribute this comic book in the South for fear of offending white Southerners. So that means that um, after the trucks came from Dell, or if this had gone through, um, the comics would be rejected by the newsstands, but they were delivered in bundles, like newspapers. If you've ever worked delivering newspapers, what am I talking about? No one does that anymore. Anyway, they came in bundles. So what that means is that all of Dell's comics for that month would be tied together in one bundle and delivered to newsstands. And if they saw, well, if they rejected Lobo, what that meant was they don't know which one that is in the bundle. They rejected the whole bundle, so none of Dell's comics were sold in the South. Is what that meant. Is what it would have meant. So Dell had really no choice but to knuckle under, because that would have been, well, that probably would have been a third of their proceeds. So Lobo was squeezed out. Apparently, in 1965 America, they weren't ready to take the risk of an African American as a title character, as the main hero of a comic book. Then, just a few months after the cancellation of Dell Comics' Lobo, the Black Panther made his first appearance in the pages of Fantastic Four, issue number 52. And the Black Panther, of course, Prince T'Challa from the fictional African country of Wakanda, which is a highly technologically advanced country that has access to this metal called vibranium that comes from a meteor that can absorb. It can absorb energy, so it can absorb impact. It's very valuable. It's a fake thing, by the way. Um, so that's interesting in itself, right? They're from. He is from this African tribe, and they're kind of depicted as sort of living in the same style as African, quote, natives with a capital N in Tarzan stories, but at the same time, they've got all this advanced technology. And he is a hero, and in this first appearance, he basically has lured the Fantastic Four to Wakanda because he's ready to go out and embark on his quest to catch the villain Claw, and he wants to test his abilities against the very best here. And he takes on the Fantastic Four and beats them, which is quite a statement. So you've got this African, this black sub-Saharan African, who is the leader of an advanced nation, who is not only competent, he is so competent he can take on the Fantastic Four, which at that time were Marvel's main stars so far as a team goes. And from there, he would join the Avengers a couple of years later and get a lot of exposure. He made a guest appearance in Daredevil before he joined the Avengers, and then he started popping up in other places. So this is significant in that, beyond the fact that the Black Panther is a famous character and a cool character, created, by the way, by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. They were still doing Fantastic Four at that time. The first black superhero. So you can make an argument that Lion Man and Ace Harlem were the first black heroes, but they were a jungle hero and a detective hero, respectively. Prince Waku, jungle hero. And T'Challa is kind of sort of a jungle hero, which I'd alluded to when I sort of was giving hints that this was going to be coming about earlier on. But he wears a costume and a mask and is a superhero. So that's a big step right there. In 1973, the Black Panther took over as the main feature, the main attraction in jungle action from Marvel. The first 4 issues had featured Kazar. I don't have the cover for number 5 up here because I thought you might like to see the introduction of Killmonger in the second story in the Black Panther's run there. These comics were drawn during the time of the Black Panther's run by several different artists and artistic teams, including Billy Graham, who was an African American artist we'll talk about later. But they were all written by Don McGregor, who was a white writer who was really, really, really invested in, I guess you could say, in diversity and in African American culture. And the stories that he did in his jungle action run for about the first dozen issues or so of the Black Panther stories in that comic provide the basic framework for the Black Panther movie, the basic plot, and many of the characters, if you've seen that. Now, there's a story that at one point the editor was frustrated with Don McGregor because sales weren't great on Jungle Action, and he was frustrated that they'd actually, I guess, been getting some complaints from readers. There's never any white people in any of these stories. I want some white people. So, issue 19, he gave us some white people, the Ku Klux Klan, getting their butts whooped by the Black Panther. Now, bear in mind, this is not a case of a black superhero having their own title, because the title of the comic isn't the Black Panther. The title of the comic is Jungle Action, featuring the Black Panther. In 1977, the Black Panther would, for the first time, get his own title, and that was the whole run of that was written and drawn by Jack Kirby. Anyway, Black Panther introduced in 1966. 1969 saw the introduction in Marvel Comics of the Falcon, alias Sam Wilson. And there's an interesting story that's been told about that. According to the story, I think it was a radio interview that Stan Lee was doing. He was pressed as to why there were not more black characters in Marvel Comics. And he said, well, we've got the Black Panther. We've got Joe Robertson, who was a supporting character in Spider-Man. And he says, and we got a new superhero coming out called the Falcon. And in reality, they did not have a new superhero coming out called the Falcon. He had just kind of made that up on the spot. And so then immediately they had to come up with a new superhero named, a black superhero named the Falcon. So they did, introduced in the pages of Captain America. The character, by the way, was officially created by Stan Lee. And did he create him when they designed the character or when he just made him up on the radio? Either way, Stan Lee and the artist Gene Colan, who was a white guy who had been in the business at that time. Well, I think he started back in the 40s. And Gene Colan, kind of like Don McGregor, was in favor of more diversity in comics. And even before this, he had been, in his assignments for Marvel for the previous couple of years, drawing more and more African American people in crowd scenes and things like that, which was something that you didn't see as much. Actually, you hardly saw it all in DC at the time. Anyway, shortly after the creation of the Falcon, he became Captain America's partner. Now, this is on the one hand kind of the same situation that we had seen back in the 40s, where the black guy is the sidekick, not the main character, and that is true. But you could argue, and I think that it's a valid argument, that the Falcon was more than just a sidekick to Captain America, because he got billing. He got equal billing. The name of the book was changed from Captain America to Captain America and the Falcon. And the Falcon appeared in the logo along with Captain America. So he was kind of a junior partner, right? It was Captain America and the Falcon, so he came second. But I don't know. I still think that that's significant. By the way, things went another significant step forward from that in this situation. In 2014, when the original Captain America, Steve Rogers, had encountered the situation where his secret formula that had made him Captain America during World War II wore off. So then he showed his appropriate age, which was like 95 or whatever. So couldn't be Captain. He probably couldn't pick up the shield, right? So Sam Wilson, the Falcon, his longtime friend and off and on partner, took on the role of Captain America and the shield. He still had wings, by the way, and the wings aren't attached to him. It's something that's mechanically augmented. But from 2014 forward, Sam Wilson, formerly the Falcon, was Captain America, and that lasted for about 2 or 3 years. After a couple of years, Steve Rogers got his powers, youth, and vitality back, and there for a while they were both Captain America. And then after 2017, Sam Wilson returned to being the Falcon. So it was a temporary step forward, but significant nonetheless. This seems like a good spot to clarify a couple of things. For one thing, when I talk about firsts, when we're discussing black characters, I'm talking about in mainstream, nationally published comic books from any of the major companies that, that doesn't include small, independent, or underground comics. Okay, stuff that would be sold on the newsstand, stuff that would be on the spinner racks around the country. Well, in that context, as I mentioned, the Black Panther was therefore the first black superhero. But he wasn't the first African American superhero because he's not American. The Falcon was the first African American superhero. Okay, that being said, I just mentioned Don McGregor and Gene Colan, and I decided I should tell you a little bit about them. Don McGregor, the writer who wrote all those Black Panther stories in Jungle Action, also worked actually with Gene Colan, Gene Colan being the co-creator of the Falcon. The two of them worked together on a very important classic series from Eclipse Comics that started, I think, maybe in late 1979, somewhere around 1980, called Detectives Incorporated, which is a hard-boiled noir detective series. And the two partners is one black guy, one white guy. They also did a series together called Ragamuffins from Eclipse Comics. And separate from Gene Colan, Don McGregor, working with Paul Gulacy, created a character in the late 70s called Saber, also for Eclipse Comics, who was the star of a science fiction fantasy kind of dystopian future kind of adventure series. And he was African American, and he had a white girlfriend. So a lot of significant additions to comic book diversity from Don McGregor and from Gene Colan. Now, by the way, I have had the opportunity over the last couple of years to interact quite a bit with Don McGregor. He's been very helpful, and he's just a really nice guy. Gene Colan, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about his work and his background because I'm going to save that for when we talk about Silver Age artists. But there to the far right, there's a picture of McGregor and Colan together. But I wanted to just give you an example of just a couple of panels. I just picked up an issue of Daredevil from 1968 and just started going through to see how much African American representation I could find. Well, I started with one issue. I went through a few. And like I mentioned before, Gene Colan was putting African Americans in crowd scenes early on. Now, when I was working on my book, I decided to do an experiment. I was wanting to see what kind of representation there was in the late 60s. And so I was wanting to look at the street level. So I took two quote unquote street level superhero comics, one from superhero characters. Well, no, I took two each from Marvel and DC, and looked at every issue from 1968 and 69. Now, I didn't look at things like the Fantastic Four or the Avengers or the Justice League because they're out in space more than half the time, probably. So I wanted to look at characters who are fighting crime on the streets to get like a better view of both who the criminals are and who the bystanders are. So I took for Marvel Amazing Spider-Man and Daredevil. And from DC, I took the two Batman books, Batman and Detective Comics. And I looked through every issue and was paying attention, right, in each panel as to the races of the people represented. So that's 4 different comic books, and I looked at 24 issues of each. And what I discovered was that, well, like I said, Gene Colan, you can see just a couple of random samples here. There's Karen Page. I think she's waiting for the subway. And then there just happens to be a black woman standing next to her. No dialogue, just that happens to be a person. And then there's another picture here of Daredevil and his alter ego of blind lawyer Matt Murdock being helped out by just a random black guy on the street. And what I discovered looking at Spider-Man and Daredevil was it wasn't just Gene Colan that was doing this. It was happening in Amazing Spider-Man as well. Most crowd scenes have got at least one black person in them. If 4 cops show up, one of them might be black, 2 of them might be black. 2 paramedics show up, one of them might be black. Also, each of those books, Amazing Spider-Man and Daredevil, had black supporting cast. Amazing Spider-Man had several. The entire Robertson family and then many of their friends. And in Daredevil, there was a recurring character who was a blind Vietnam veteran who was befriended by Matt Murdock, represented by Matt Murdock, and eventually gets employment from Murdock. In addition to that, there were race-centric storylines in both Amazing Spider-Man and Daredevil. One of which from Amazing Spider-Man we're going to look at in some detail in a little bit. Beyond that, in Daredevil, the Black Panther showed up as a guest star. So Marvel by the late 1960s was comparatively starting to do a pretty good job with African American representation and diversity, at least in having black people there and visible. That's not how things were looking in the Batman titles. So with both of those titles, Batman and Detective Comics, over that 2-year, 48-issue period, apparently only one black person came to Gotham City, and he was on a traveling basketball team. To be fair, though, I looked at 1968 and 69, and then when I went a little bit forward into 1970, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams took over both books, and you immediately started seeing a lot more African Americans, both as characters and as bystanders. In the early 1970s, something happened on movie screens that was going to have a huge impact on comic books, particularly on race in comic books, especially where African Americans were concerned. And I'm talking about the sudden wave of movies that came to be called blaxploitation movies. Now, this is a play on words. There's an expression that was already in use, exploitation movie. And exploitation movies were the kind that were shown in cheap grindhouse theaters or in drive-ins that were cheaply made, usually poorly made, and usually exploiting some sordid or sensational situation that was going to attract people to the theater, and often exploiting some group. Like a lot of exploitation movies were, well, featured a lot of nudity or a lot of sexually suggestive things, like surfer Nazis from Mars and stuff like that. There were a lot of prison movies, especially women's prison movies. So that term exploitation started to come to apply to this wave of movies that came out that centered on black people. Some of them made by black artists and others not. Now, the first movie to really make a splash that was of this variety was Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, followed closely by Shaft, and then another huge hit in '72, Superfly, and there were dozens and dozens of others. And these films not only had mostly black casts and black heroes, a lot of times white people were, well, not to say white people were the villains, but to say the villains were often white people. And the black hero was often seen as struggling against the man, struggling against the establishment, struggling against structural racism, really. And so the thought was black audiences would identify with that, black audiences would cheer that on, and that these movies would do well in black neighborhoods. But what the producers of Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song and Shaft weren't anticipating was how much crossover appeal these movies would have. They were hugely, hugely popular and would make an enormous amount of money compared to the amount of money it took to make them, right? So white audiences came and saw these movies in droves, and it was a huge success. Well, obviously this is going to cause some comic book publishers to think that maybe this is a trend that they could get in on. Now, incidentally, at exactly the same time, roughly the same time, kung fu movies from Hong Kong were also exploding in popularity. So there's two huge cinematic trends that are making a lot of money. And some publishers started thinking, maybe we could cash in on this. And one publisher decided to make a blaxploitation superhero. Talking about Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, who debuted in June 1972 in the comic book of that title, Luke Cage, Hero for Hire. Now, in a lot of ways, this was a business decision to cash in on the popularity of the blaxploitation movies. So he was kind of designed by committee. So editor Roy Thomas and writer Archie Goodwin and Marvel's art director at that time, John Romita Sr., got together. They came up with the concept for the character and the basic look of the character. Then Archie Goodwin wrote the first issue, George Tuska penciled it, and Billy Graham inked it. Billy Graham being the only black person in the whole operation. After a few issues, he took over pencils and inks. And from the beginning, this was something different. He had a different look than most Marvel characters. It was the setting was in New York City, like most of the Marvel superheroes were, but it was a much darker, grittier, seamier New York City. The dialogue was very different. Luke Cage was written by Archie Goodwin and subsequent writers as having what would come to be known as jive slang. That is the slang of African Americans of the time, except it wasn't written by African Americans. It was written by a middle-aged white guy who was to trying to guess what African American slang sounds like. He did his research. He read some books by African American authors that were crime novels set in New York City. Unfortunately, some of the books that he read were almost parodies and weren't meant to be taken seriously, and were using such exaggerated language it was ridiculous, and he thought that was the real thing. So Luke Cage sounded like, well, they were attempting to make him sound like a man of the streets. And some readers interpreted it that way, but it was greatly, greatly exaggerated. Part of the problem was that they wanted him to sound like a man of the streets, but they couldn't actually have him use bad language, couldn't have him say any major swear words. So instead, he was always saying his favorite seemed to be "Sweet Christmas," occasionally tossing in "Sweet Sister," or other, even sometimes even more ridiculous things. Well, the character himself, his real name was Carl Lucas, and he had been a member of a New York street gang who had been wrongfully convicted of a crime that he didn't commit and sent to prison. While in prison, he was given the opportunity to volunteer to participate in some very dangerous experiments, and a possible reward might be getting out of prison earlier. So he agreed to submit to these experiments. Unfortunately, while the scientist was doing this stuff, there was a really sadistic prison guard who had taken a disliking to Carl Lucas, and he interfered with the experiment and made it go wrong, and there was an explosion which killed the scientist. And Carl Lucas discovered, having survived this explosion, that now he'd been infused with all this power and he was super strong. So he escaped from prison rather than take the blame for yet another crime he didn't commit, and took off. And as he's escaping, he's enveloped in a hail of bullets from the guards. And then as he's jumping into the water from Seagate Prison, which is kind of like Alcatraz, it's on an island. However, what the guards don't realize, they assume he's dead, is that in addition to super strength, he also has steel hard skin, which means that the bullets had actually just bounced off of him. So now he has a new lease on life. Carl Lucas, so far as anyone knows, is dead. So he adopts a new name, Luke from Lucas and Cage from what he had been in, Luke Cage. And he decides to use his newfound abilities to make a living. So he goes to Times Square and rents a kind of a crappy little office upstairs above an old movie theater that only shows old movies, and sets himself up as a private detective slash private security person, hero for hire. And then from there, he gets a really colorful costume, it's the 1970s, so there's a lot of looks like some polyester going on there, and a lot of bracelets and headbands and chains and all that stuff. Kind of looks like he could have been a backup singer for Parliament Funkadelic, and that was the beginning of his adventures. Okay, now let's stop and think about everything that I just said in the context of 1972 comic books and all the stuff we've seen in comic books so far. All right. Clearly, he's not somebody's sidekick. Clearly, he is not supposed to be a comedy relief character, though he has some funny lines now and then. What he is a former gang member, reformed gang member, but a gang member nonetheless, who had been in prison, a black man sent to prison on false charges that he was innocent of, and while in prison, subjected to kind of shady, questionable experimentation by the government. Then further victimized by corrupt guards, victimized and almost murdered. And then, after making his escape, he is a black man who is bulletproof. Okay, so think about all of that, not just in the context of 1972, but in the context of 2020 and things that are still going on. And if you know anything about African American history or American history, you'll know that a lot of those themes there are echoes of the sorts of things that black people have experienced in this country, particularly, well, like the experimentation and stuff in the 20th century, the criminal justice system being stacked against them. And if you think about the fact that those blaxploitation films were part of their goal was to have a character that black audiences would identify with but also cheer for, right? Because they'd get to see him get the upper hand. He's a big black man who is bulletproof. So let that sink in. I'll think about that for a little bit. So to summarize or to recap, when it comes to mainstream comics that had a significant readership, not like Independence, when it comes to that, I think it's safe to say that the first black comic book hero was Prince Waku. Now, Vuda, there's just too many questionable things there, and the characters that appeared in all Negro comics, technically they were the first heroes, but they had almost no exposure. So far as, and there's only one issue of that. So far as a continuing series, a black hero with a continuing feature, although not a comic book, Prince Waku, the first black character to actually have their own comic book with their name on it was Lobo from Dell Comics, 1965. The first black superhero was the Black Panther. However, the Falcon was the first African American superhero. And the first superhero character, black or African American, or black and or, to have their own comic book, their own title, was Luke Cage. Now, it's my opinion, but I think that I can make a good argument for it, that the popularity of blaxploitation movies greatly sped up the process of having black heroes as the main heroes of their own comic book, because it would make money, right? They saw that white audiences were eating up these blaxploitation movies. So non-white characters started having their own titles. Now, previously, there had been a handful of Asian characters, like, for example, Charlie Chan, who was very problematic, who had had their own titles. A handful of Native American Indians back in the 1940s and 50s that had their own title, but never a black character until it had been proved popular and financially advisable, which is not to say that it wouldn't have happened, but I don't know how much longer it would have been before it happened. I think that Luke Cage showing up when he did and how he did was had an economic impetus to branch out and try that. Now, it succeeded, and his comic ran for several years, and so you started seeing more non-white characters with not only being created, but having their own comic books. Now, the big three from Marvel, and they remained the big three black heroes from Marvel for decades, have all appeared on screen in recent years. Black Panther and the Falcon have appeared on screen together, which is really cool to see that up on the screen. And I can only imagine what it might be like for either a young African American kid seeing that, or maybe a middle-aged person like me who's African American, who grew up when I did and only had a handful of heroes that looked like them, to now see those heroes live on screen. And the one thing that, well, I won't say the one thing, there's more than one thing that I regret about how these characters have been treated. The other thing I regret is that the Luke Cage series got canceled. I wish it had kept going. But I was really surprised, unpleasantly surprised, that when Captain America Civil War came out and we were introduced to Sam Wilson, the Falcon, I didn't see any publicity at all for that movie or for the subsequent movies the Falcon appeared in. Nothing anywhere that mentioned the Falcon was the first African American superhero. And that is extraordinarily historically important. And I think that should have been stressed more. And I'm stressing it now to you.